Welcome to my camp podcast brought to you by Happy Camper Live and the special series called My Camp Lives On. And this episode is near and dear to my heart because we are going to be revisiting Camp Belgrade. And Camp Belgrade was in existence in North Belgrade, Maine from 1937 until 1984. And it's where I went for the first 4 years of my camp career. And my memories of it are so strong that about 15 years ago, I started an alumni website, campbelgrade.com, to keep alive the memories of a place that was so important to so many people, which is exactly what we talk about here on the My Camp Lives On podcast. And so I'm going to ask these two guests of mine to introduce themselves. Jill?
Hello, I am Jill Eiseman Witherell, one of the twin daughters of the Camp Belgrade camp owners, Mort and Vera Eiseman. I am wearing my shirt, my Camp Belgrade shirt. Those are the colors, gray and maroon. That were used throughout the camp for its many, many years. I have two sons, both of whom were campers at Camp Belgrade, and I have a grandson who camp was over before he was old enough to go, but he actually now at 18 is the head counselor at a day camp in New Jersey that he had been a camper at since he was old enough to go to that camp. So camping is definitely in the genes and in the blood.
And your twin sister is here as well, Jane?
Yes, hi, I'm Jane Eiseman Sharf. I live in Newark, Delaware, and I am fortunate enough to have a summer camp cottage on Great Pond, very near where Camp Belgrade was, maybe about a mile down the lake, up the lake. And I can see with binoculars the old campsite, which now is very expensive homes, year-round homes. But we spend every summer at our place on Great Pond. Now, since we're retired, my husband and I from the University of Delaware, we can spend about 4 months on the lake. And I have two children, a daughter and a son. Our son was very briefly at Camp Belgrade after Mort's era. He was pretty young then. I think he was about 7. He has a few memories of it. And then I have 4 grandsons. They, all of them, plus our son, since Camp Belgrade was no longer in existence, but we wanted them to have a camping experience, they all went to Camp Caribou, which is in the Waterville area, because their philosophy was similar to our dad's at Camp Belgrade. We felt it was. So there has been a continuation of summer camping.
Thank you. So very interesting, right? So we have Mort Eiseman's 2 twin daughters, and Camp Belgrade was an all-boys camp for about 150 boys who went for a 1 8-week session. But I would love for one of you just to tell our audience the history of the camp as you guys know it and you remember it to be.
Well, both Jill and I had written a history of Camp Belgrade about 10 or 15 years ago, and I have it here, and I'll be happy to read some of it. Camp Belgrade was founded in 1937 by Mort and Vera Eiseman, who owned and ran the camp for the next 40 years. It was located on the site of the former girls' camp, Jolie, which existed in the early 1900s. It covered approximately 150 acres from Route 8 down to Great Pond. It had 2 sandy beaches, docks and floats, tennis courts, a basketball court, a baseball field, softball, soccer field, riflery range, nature hut with live animals, arts and crafts building, a council ring, and in the early days, a chemistry lab and a boxing ring. One of the larger buildings was a lodge where original plays were put on, movies shown, and camp dances held. Rows of individual cabins called bunks for approximately 150 boys were located along pathways lined with painted white rocks. A main building housed the dining room, kitchen, and dorm upstairs for support staff. The camp also had a shower house and on-site laundry. There were 3 canoe sheds holding Old Town canoes, a fleet of sturdy wooden rowboats, sailboats, and a bathhouse for boys to change into swim trunks at the larger beach and water skiing at the smaller beach.
I'm going to jump in.
Yes.
I'm going to jump in just for a second to say that both Jane and I have Old Town canoes that were originally from Camp Belgrade. So we take advantage of using those to paddle down to those sandy beaches.
Right. So I can sort of, you don't have to continue to read on the history, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to have Richard and Andy talk about like some of the programs that were run, and the Sachem and Beaver Eagle and all those kind of things when they continue on towards the end of this podcast. But that is exactly what it is now. So what's interesting is that Jane was talking about Great Pond. So Great Pond is a huge lake. So the Belgrade Lakes regions of Maine are made up of a number of lakes, and a lot of them have the word pond, but we know they are big, full-size lakes, right?
Yes, it's a chain of 7 interconnected lakes that make up the Belgrade Lakes. A couple of things that maybe Andy and Richie might not know is more about the early history of camp, and they might not remember some of these things, that there was a full-time chef and baker at camp. There was a full-time laundry, which after there was a fire burnt down and was not rebuilt. But campers came from all over the East Coast and Quebec, Canada, and mostly it was predominantly a Jewish upper middle class families that sent their kids. And they stopped, I don't think the boys will remember this, there was a train station in North Belgrade that was specifically for camps. And there was a camp train every year that stopped there and unloaded the campers. And it's maybe a mile and a half from Camp Belgrade. It now has been moved and is a church. But at the time, it was a stop for summer camps.
Right, because up in the area, right, was Kennebec and Manitou and Matoka for girls. So right in that area, there were a number of very successful camps.
Lots of, yes, there were lots of camps, and they all probably made use of that train station until it closed, probably in the early 60s, maybe I'm thinking 1960s.
Right.
And one of the humorous things I think that would happen would be if some of those camp trains came on the same days and unloaded all of the baggage cars. There was this enormous tangle of duffel bags and trunks that would pile up 7 high in huge mounds that then counselors or whoever was responsible for separating them out and figuring which camp, which items of baggage belong to, and then haul them away in trucks and vehicles to the appropriate camp. You can imagine the confusion that may have resulted from that.
How,
In
how,
those
o-
days,
go ahead,
oh,
I'm sorry.
just going to say, in those days, every camper had a trunk. Nowadays, they use duffel bags and other things for camp. But in those days, even when Jill and I went to camp, because we went to a girls' camp for many years, you had a trunk with your name, and it was shipped up to North Belgrade, where Jill described the chaos at the train station.
I actually, when I started at Belgrade, I used my father's army trunk, his original army trunk. It has his name on it. How old were you when when Mort and Vera started the camp? Were you?
We were not born.
Oh, okay.
Right.
We're not that old.
Oh,
They
that's
started
true.
in 37. And our first summer when we came up with our parents was 1944. We were infants.
Oh, okay. Got it. Right. I'm not doing the math right, so we'll edit that part out, okay? So how interesting. So Mort and Vera started the camp in 1937. They didn't have children at the time, and then you guys were born, and all of a sudden, 2 girls, but it's an all boys camp. So do you remember summers there, running around before you guys went off to whatever girls' camp you went to?
Yes. Well, vaguely. Uh, I remember we had a bedroom in the house, and as babies in the cribs, it was a wooden floor in the bedroom, and I was a very active infant and loved to rock in my crib. And one of the earliest stories that I can remember is that apparently I rocked my way to the door and no one could get in the bedroom until they figured out that a different access to it. But we usually, when we were very young, because both Mort and Vera were completely involved with the day-to-day operation of the camp, generally there was a young college girl who would come for the summer and
Hired as our counselor,
Right.
who
yeah,
took care of us. And I don't think you mentioned, Jill, our parents had a cabin on the property. That was our house, and it had a couple of porches, and it had a fence all around the front yard, and that was where we played with the counselor. We were not allowed on camp property, Mort's idea, while activities were going on with the boys. We could, maybe during rest period, we could go out or swim when the boys were not at activities, but he didn't want any children, little girls, running around the camp. So we were restricted with this counselor, our counselor, to just doing things right around the house and in the house and the yard.
So I know the house. It was behind Boys Bunk 1 and Boys Bunk 2. I remember in 1974, we knocked on the door and we asked if we could sit and watch as President Nixon resigned. And my bunk sat in the living room or the den with your parents and watched that historic event at Camp Belgrade. Pretty cool, huh?
Yeah.
yeah.
So tell me about Mort in his sort of, as I didn't know him, obviously, by the time I got there, he was the grandfather figure. But in the early days and when he was, extremely active in the day-to-day operations on campus, what were the areas of camp that he thrived in or he loved or he would participate in with the kids?
he he had um he had a wonderful rapport with the not just the campers, but with their families. And I think he really loved the time at that time there were several weekends that were parent weekends, so parents had options of which weekends to come to visit. And I think he loved the opportunity of meeting with and talking to the parents on an individual basis, sharing with them about their children's experiences. He himself had been a very avid tennis player when he was younger, but he didn't actually get involved with any of the sports, that at least not that I can remember. But he enjoyed walking, spending a lot of time walking around the camp and watching.
Also, another of his strengths was, I guess we would call it counseling, not not being a counselor, but psychological counseling. Whenever there was a troubled child, he would have the camper come and he would sit and talk with the boy. And there were other issues. He was always available. He was very good at solving problems. And although his degree was not in psychology, he pretty much was a child psychologist.
I can hear that. What was
Yeah.
Mort's? What was Vera's role in the in the running of camp?
She was in
Food.
charge of, oh, sorry, go ahead, Jill.
I was just going to say food, and more food. Did she
She
learn?
planned all the menus, she ordered all the food, she was in touch with all the,
Vendors.
yeah, vendors, right, that's the right word. And she was in charge of the kitchen, the menus, any kind of food related things. And she worked on it during the winter and made sure that the camp had lots of good nutrition, nutritious meals.
Yeah, she really taught herself how to be a nutritionist. And, when you're feeding over 200 people every day for 8 weeks plus, that could be quite a daunting task. She also, one of the memories that I have when we were old enough that we lived at camp, but we worked at the State House, the Maine State House during the summer as summer jobs, but we would be back in the evening, was that the counselors loved to come and spend time once they were finished with their cabin duties, to come over to the house and play cards, just have conversations, relax, listen to music. And Vera always took one of the counselors that was in the house and took them over to the huge walk-in refrigerator in the main dining hall and would basically go on a kitchen raid, bring back over to the house desserts of various kinds, leftovers, and that was such a treat for everybody. She really indulged their food fancies.
Where did you guys grow up? Were you in the city, in New York City?
Yeah, we lived in Manhattan. And then between 7th and 8th grade, we moved out to Scarsdale. Our parents bought a house. We lived there for about 12 years and moved back into the city. And then Jill got married, and I was around for a little bit before I went on to graduate school.
Because I actually was in your parents in their apartment when because I was a Boston kid, so I was in New York and went to Mort and Vera's home to see the slideshow about what camp, that's the way they did it. They put on the slideshow.
I have all the slides here.
Yeah.
But most of all the things that pretty much connected to camp are in Maine, in my house in Maine, including my T-shirt and all kinds of memorabilia.
What,
I-
go ahead. Yes.
I was just going to say, thinking about the slideshow, it's now, as I had mentioned earlier, I live in Western Pennsylvania, about an hour and a half from Pittsburgh. I can remember Mort would make many, many trips to the different cities to recruit families to do just what you described, show them slides, talk about camp, answer questions.
Interview them.
And when he, as a child, ourselves as children, when he would take his trips to Pittsburgh, because we had grown up and lived at that point our whole lives in New York City, my concept of Pittsburgh was that he was going to the West Coast.
Right. That makes sense. You also had a very big Baltimore contingent always at camp, right?
Yes,
Baltimore, Washington, Philadelphia, which Mort was from Philadelphia, grew up in Philadelphia.
Pittsburgh.
And Richmond, not Richmond, Norfolk.
Right.
And then west to Pittsburgh and eventually Chicago, Ohio. It was a whole group from Ohio, then Boston, and then this Canadian contingent.
Yeah,
And where did you guys end up going to camp?
Pine Cliff.
Pine
Oh.
Cliff, which was on the western part of the state.
Yes, my sister was a brown, blue and brown, and
Yep, blue and
I knew
Yep.
Hammy and Susie very, very well back in the
Yep.
day. That's where my sister went for many, many years. So that's
Yeah, and
very,
Ann-
very special camp.
Right, right.
Yeah. And Mort could have chosen any of them, right? I mean, he was friends with all of the owners up there. It's a very
they
tight
knew
knit.
all the camp directors. The very first camp that we ever went to was Somerset before Pine Cliff, but that was the last year that the original owners had it, and then they sold it, and they said, we would like the twins to come. So we went there for 1 year, and then the camp was sold, and our parents decided that Pine Cliff was a better match for us. So
just to tell you something about Somerset that actually will work in exactly in terms of what this series is about. So Somerset closed for many, many years, and nothing happened to the property. It sat there and sat there and sat there. And then some camp guys bought it and started it all over again. And it's doing really, really well. And if I could afford to buy the old Belgrade site and get rid of all those mansions and put that camp back up, I'd do it in a heartbeat.
Yeah.
I think Andy wanted to do that. And after Mort sold the camp, he sold it to Bruce Schlossberg, who had been a camper, and his son, Greg. He bought it for Greg to run it. And unfortunately, it didn't make it.
Unfortunately, right in that era, in the mid 80s, a number of really good camps closed their doors in various pockets of the Northeast.
I actually have Bruce's letter to us, and in part of it, he said, the 3 summers which we tried to operate the camp were spectacularly unsuccessful. And the 1 summer which Dick Meltzer tried to operate, it was a disaster. That says something about our ability to operate a summer camp, as well as the marketing potential for a general activity camp. And I think, as you're saying, in part it was a sign of the times, but I think that that has changed.
There were a lot of the specialty camps were coming in then, and now it seems to have swung back again to more general type camping.
Yeah,
I think you're living proof that it could work and be very successful.
Well, traditional camps and specialty camps. I mean, there are 4,000 camps. There are thousands and thousands of camps and that run all sorts of programs and sessions and like that. And the most important thing is to be able to send your child to camp, no matter what kind of camp it is, and have that kind of experience. Before we wrap up, because I'm going to get a lot of the ins and outs of what the boys did at
Yeah.
at Belgrade with Rich and Andy. Talk about the Belgrade plaques. What they were, to explain what they were, because I remember mine vividly.
I'm sorry, the Belgrade what?
Plaques, the plaques.
Yeah, Jane,
plaques.
do you remember?
See, I have everything in Maine. I have plaques in Maine. I have our plaques and our.
Do you have Mort and Vera's plaques? I don't think we have them.
I don't think so. But everything I have is too bad we're not doing this in the summer, because I have lots of things.
Well, that's okay, because what we'll do is we have a lot of stuff that actually, as we're talking, Austin has edited in and is put into the podcast. But we'll get some more stuff. But explain, if you would, Jill, what happens what happened when you would start a first summer at camp.
When you
Okay, I have a little thing here. Each camper and counselor made his own plaque, which was hung on the walls and rafters of the lodge building. A star was added each year. The person attended camp. One of these sticky little gold stars. In addition, there was the sachem. I don't know what, maybe Andy and Rich will talk about that also. But these plaques were made out of wood originally. Then I think later a different material. And they had the camper's name painted on. And then for each year you put a star. And then if you were a TIC or a CA, that was added on there. It was painted on. And then counselor.
Right. So I remember it vividly. So it was in 3 different sections. So the top section was Camp Gray, and the middle was white, where you would write your name, and the bottom was maroon. And in the top you would handwrite the CB logo, and then you'd write your name, and then each year that you came to camp, you would add a star. And so in the Belgrade Little Playhouse, as they called it, on the right hand side were all the plaques of the kids that were currently at camp and the staff. And then after you would finish your camp career, you would go up in the rafters. But the rafters and the walls of the playhouse were so packed that they then had to move them, and there were tons of them in the dining hall.
Right.
And now the dining hall still exists, doesn't it?
It does. It was moved down from its original location.
There's a picture.
Is that's the original or the second one?
This was the original. I found this. This was probably a promotional booklet that was put out at the original when the camp was originally started with our dad and Mort Levy. And it had pictures in it of the different buildings and different, let's see, here's the inside of the lodge, which was never rebuilt. I mean, that was the original. And
that's where the plaques were.
Right.
And then there were the bunks.
Yeah. So when I was there, if you took a tennis ball and you put it in the middle of the bunk, it would roll to the back corner of the bunk. And then you'd go to the bunk next door and you put the tennis ball in the middle, it would roll to the front of the bunk. You never knew.
They were very old bunks.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were. They
were. I think many of them were original from Camp Jolie from the 1920s or the early 1900s. And then newer ones were built later when the camp expanded.
Right. Is there anything else you want to leave our audience with? This has been so much fun, and I hope that you guys have enjoyed reminiscing about that special place
in
Maine's Great Mountains.
Go on for hours with stuff about camp. But we were only there until we were 8. And then we were sent off to girls' camps And so the day-to-day activities, we were not as aware of things. I'd say from 8 to 16, when we then came back. Once we were in college, we worked, as Jill mentioned, we worked for the state, the highway department in Augusta, and we lived at camp, but we left very early in the morning and came home. Like we were gone from 7 to 6. And then the evening, we could socialize with whoever came into the house, the counselors, and we were friendly with a lot of them.
Anything, Jill, you want to add?
Just thinking about the longtime friendships that the Belgrade campers talk about, their experiences and how many of these friendships have developed at camp and have been maintained as friendships for many, many years. And Jane and I still are in touch with several of the women who we first got to know at Camp Pinecliff when we were 9 years old.
And also we were in touch with some of the campers, like Dick Meltzer, when he was trying to run camp and we were just a mile away at our place, would come over. You'll probably edit this out, but he had to borrow money from us to pay the payroll. And Vinny dropped by, and a bunch of different people who were connected with camp because we were so close. Although those were in the waning days of camp, we didn't have our place until 1980.
Well, I'll tell you this is what I'll end with you guys. So I tell my opening story the first day of camp every single summer about going to Logan Airport with my Belgrade uniform on. And by the way, the shirt that Jill's wearing, like, you had to wear uniform every single day at Belgrade. It was a uniform boys camp. You had to wear that shirt and you had to wear gray shorts. Sometimes they had stripes down the side of in maroon. In the later days, they stopped doing it that way. And Sherm Reese was the man who they sent to bring us up from Boston. Now, think about this, right? I'm 8 years old and they send Sherm. To me, he was 110. I'm like, where am I going? But he took very good care of us on that.
Yeah, he was a special
I also
person.
want to mention, were you at the reunion that was held?
Yes,
in
in Boston,
so
of course.
you know how many people came and how much Camp Belgrade meant to so many boys, now men, of course, grown. And it was very nice for us to hear that, things that people said about our parents, especially about Mort, and how much it meant to them and how it had an impact on their lives as they were growing up.
Well, I can tell you that it had a tremendous impact on my life, and your dad had a tremendous impact on my life. And that's why I am a camp director. And that's why I am doing this series, because we are going to get this out to everybody that's all the Belgrade alumni, so that they can reminisce a little bit with the two of you and with Rich and with Andy. So Jill and Jane, thank you so much for joining us on the My Camp Lives On podcast. So now we're going to continue with this podcast of Camp Belgrade, as the audience knows, my original camp, and a camp that is so near and dear to my heart. And I'm going to ask these two distinguished gentlemen to introduce themselves. I have known them for over 50 years. I was 8 years old when I started Camp Belgrade, and Richard was kind of like a big brother to me at camp, and Andy, even though we have the last name, was like a brother in kind to me. So Richard, why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about where you come from, your years at Belgrade, and we'll get started that way.
Sure. So I use Richard these days, but I was always Richie at camp. And so today we can revert back to that. Richard Teller. I started in 1966, and I didn't stop until 1979. So it was a really big part of my life. And I actually sort of liked it more as a counselor than I did as a kid. So it was kind of a great finish. I was homesick when I started, even though I still remember when August rolled around, I couldn't quite figure it out, but I never quite wanted to go home. But then the next summer I'd be homesick again in the beginning. So I was kind of a mess in the beginning, but it just kept getting better. So I stuck around for a few years.
Andy?
Hi, my name is Andy Miller. I started at Camp Belgrade in 1969, and I went all the way through 79, just like Richie, but then I returned for Dick Meltzer's summer of 1983.
Right. So as we had spoken, right, just as we spoke about Mort Eiseman's family on the camp through when, Andy?
Through 76.
76. And then Greg Schlossberg
And then
took
Greg-
over
Greg
for how many
Schlossberg
years?
for the summers of 77, 78, and 79.
Right. And then what happened? It was closed did it close and then reopen?
It was closed for the summers of 80, 81, and 82.
Oh, okay. I don't think I knew that.
It just laid there, and every path that had been scraped free of growth was now beautiful, lush, green grass. Every field that had kids running on it didn't for 3 years. So it was gorgeous. And then one day, of course, after the summer of 83, it was sold to become what is known as Loon Cove.
So Andy, tell us where you grew up and your history with Belgrade goes really, really deep.
My history goes back to my father, who started in 1939 and went all the way through till he graduated from medical school in 55. At 55. He couldn't do the summer of 55 because he had to go and be an intern. But he started in 39 and he did everything. You'll hear Richie someday in his introduction of my father at the 1980 reunion. And Richie knew that my father was on the maintenance staff for a whole summer because he had the nerve to say to Mort, "I don't think I'm coming." And then just like Richie at the last, he said, "Oh shit, I'm coming. Of course I'm coming." And he made him roll the tennis courts for a whole summer. So I have all those beautiful clay tennis courts that were rolled by hand. That's what my dad did for a summer during medical school.
But that
because
was
he had
not
nerve-
BB, but that was not BB's last hurrah at camp at all.
Right. He returned as a parent, of course, but later as the camp physician, and every 2 weeks had a different doctor from Pittsburgh come up for 2 glorious weeks in Maine, but they were always obstetricians. The only boys' summer camp where the doctor for all 8 weeks was an obstetrician.
We were covered.
So all these people knew, including my father, all these people knew how to say was, how far apart are your contractions? And if it was anything other than that, they were in the station wagon on the way to Thayer Hospital. That's all they could do. That's it.
I knew BB obviously as my 4 years as a camper there as the camp doctor. Rich, you look like you're dying to jump in.
No, it's just so funny because BB and Gwen, Andy's mom, were like extra parents to all of us for, I don't know, it felt like the rest of my life there. And, and in fact, I spoke to Gwen just several weeks ago. They were so much fun. I mean, God help us that we were lucky. And in all my years there were never really serious injuries, right? I mean, we never saw, I don't know, David, in these days, if you see, just much more that goes on, if there more contact sports or whatever. But, we were pretty lucky Because you're right, we would have had to go somewhere quickly if anything really went wrong.
If anything really went bad, all you had, you couldn't do it. Hey, you remember, I just saw something. You remember a movie called Weekend at Bernie's,
Of course.
right?
Yeah.
Look closely at this.
Holding up Vinny.
That's Vinny. I think that movie came from somebody at Belgrade. I mean, that's Bernie.
I have to tell you, you just talking about camp doctors, you just pointed in my head when I first got there, like a lot of things in the 60s, it really felt like the 40s. There was a really kind of there was an old-fashioned quality to it. And the first doctor I remember there was, as the song goes, good old Dr. Schnabel.
Dr. Schnabel.
Right? And he was 1,000 years old and still had a very heavy German accent. And the way Schnabes, as we called it, listened to your heart was with an old wooden stethoscope.
Yeah.
That one side went in his ear, and the little trumpet went onto your chest.
Yeah.
I'd never seen anything like it, but it was my first, realization that you don't want to get sick there.
Yeah.
I need you guys to individually tell our audience, what was it about this place that all these years later made it just so special and unique? Because I personally think about, and I've now been in this business in the camping industry for a long time, right? 4 years at Belgrade, 5 at Tuckahoe, then another 4 years, and now 25 years at my own place. And yet those 4 years when I was 8, 9, 10, and 11 were so instrumental in who I've become. And you guys spent even more time. What was it, Andy?
Just a place that was so accepting of everybody and anything that you were even remotely interested in, from a pure athlete to a pure non-athlete, and everybody in between. There was something for everybody. It was startling. And I have a lot of stuff here about John Roach and the Belgrade Little Theater. Beautiful things here, but it's interesting. I went to a private school for a while, not complete, here in Pittsburgh, Shadyside Academy, and a very famous graduate, David McCullough, the historian, John Adams. He lived 30 seconds from here, recently deceased. David McCullough talks a lot about when he was at Shadyside, how there was a place for everybody, from the athlete to the non-athlete. And on weekends, they'd go down to Carnegie Mellon University to the museum, or they go to the theater in downtown Pittsburgh. And I thought, my God, if I change a few things around, this guy is describing Camp Belgrade, where there's just something for everybody, and nobody felt left out. I thought it was extraordinary. There may be other, Kennebec may have been just like it, Tuckahoe may have been just like it, and I'd be happy to know that they are and were, but I know that the only one I know from personal experience is Belgrade, and there was just something for everybody.
Rich?
Yeah, I have to agree with that. I think, in my experience, you had to fight a little for that acceptance in that place that you truly felt. But I was there 100 years, so it finally kind of worked its way into my being. But I totally agree with you. The things that I remember are not necessarily in an instruction session on the baseball field. It was the off times. It was what you did in between things, or during optional swim in the morning, or evening activities, or camping trips. And it was the people that you were doing it with. And, we're 3 examples of people. We've lasted many, many decades, right? And some of our friends, Dick started in 1955, and and Greg started in 1965, and I mean or 62, excuse me, and you just felt like you found people that you wanted to be with, and there was a certain, and I have to, we did a lot of joking about Mort, because that's sort of what you do when you're a kid, and there were values there. And again, it wasn't so much in, there used to be sermons, there was this sort of mock Friday night, or it was like a sort of a camp tradition that was quasi Friday night service. It wasn't religious per se, but it was, he did a sermon. There were all these little traditions that, you'd hear Mort sort of have his speech, and they were similar over the years, but they were all actually, there was a lot to learn from them. And you took it in and you ran around 5 minutes later and you forgot it. But I don't think we forgot it. I think what we might share is, there were some values passed on, and what a great thing while you are in the setting. I mean, we can't, I think you have one at Starlight, but we all know that view over our lake where we might as well have had it to ourselves, Pine Island, that's, I think, the oldest boys camp in the state, but small and quiet, right? Sailing, they don't do jet skis there. We had this incredible sort of natural resource. It was all ours, all those years. And I know we can all see it. We can taste the water, and it was just, I mean, it was a privilege that compounded. As I said, it got better every year, I think.
To this day, if I ever go through any kind of an exercise, okay, whether it's in a meditation class or anything now for 50 years, and I'm told to close my eyes and picture a place and put myself in a place, it's always the exact same spot. And I've never shared this with anybody, but you two are the perfect people to share it with. So right below the dining room, right below the mess hall, where the nature shack was, where you would play Capture the Flag, which in this day and age, you would never play Capture the Flag with all the roots. You could kill yourself.
You stole my thunder. I had a whole speech about that.
Okay, well, you can get to that. But then
Yeah.
down below to the right, where the Indian Council Ring was, and then a little bit
Council
below there, in between the Council Ring and the boys and the waterfront, there were these big rocks.
Big rocks, yeah.
And I would go and sit on those rocks and grab two sticks. And I didn't play the drums, but I would just hit the rocks as the water was splashing up on Great Pond, which is the name of our lake. And that, to this day, is my place. If we were to do something, close your eyes, put yourself in a very special, quiet place, that's where I go.
That's funny because you couldn't walk there on a path or even on grass. You
Right.
had to go beyond the council ring
Yep.
to an area that wasn't even an area, because it
Right.
wasn't the ski beach, and it wasn't the boating beach, and it wasn't the swim beach or the sailing beach. It was this little projection of nothing but
It
rocks.
was rocks and the bed of pine needles over the roots.
Yes.
And then this sort of, it was a Zen temple for us. And you're right. And I tell you what, Jeff Dunn took a beautiful black and white picture looking out on to that area from just behind it, that was up in every room I had. We ended up going to college together. And I think that's when I got it. And it was up in my, it's not here anymore, but I had that up for decades because of the same reason, David.
I know exactly where you're. Now, let me ask you just a stupid question. was that sand bottom? If you had jumped in the lake there,
Yes.
was that sand?
It was rockier, but it was still sand.
Yeah, because you could occasionally come over there with Bernie Hirsch to do fishing, right?
But you were sitting in a boat.
Yes, you're in a boat, of course. Yeah.
Yeah,
What were you
and
going,
he would-
what were you going to say about
The roots.
the roots?
No, it's so funny because I have a whole folder here about Fun Week and how I thought, you know, the greatest thing ever was Commandos. The Belgrade race, I sit here and laugh if I read some of the things to you, just amazing. You know, Cowboys and Indians, I didn't really understand that. You know, you get in the stockade with that stupid little piece of paper. But I thought the one I really didn't think was interesting was Fun Week, Capture the Flag. Because it was all on a field. What I thought was, just like David said, you want to play Capture the Flag, you get in that pine grove, you get in the rocks and the roots and that big water intake pipe coming up from the lake. Now that's Capture the Flag.
Right?
It was the best, wasn't it?
Right? If there's no chance of a traumatic brain injury, it ain't Capture the Flag.
What Andy's referencing is, and we talked about this. So who wants to give a quick Beaver Eagle Sachem, Grand Sachem thing? Got to do it quickly and then talk about this Fun Week because I want.
How about Sachem instructions?
Oh.
You do it, Andy.
Be prepared to sign your name in blood on request. You can't talk to anybody for the first 24 hours after being elected a sachem. You must wear your clothes inside out and backwards. You must eat with only a knife.
That's true. So Beaver Eagle was a summer long, what would be called color war. Some camps are no longer using that term. That's what it was. So Andy, how did it work?
Well, the camp got split up into two teams, Beavers and Eagles, and every week there was something, either something called a mixed meet, where each age group competed, Beaver, Eagle, you know, and then there were the big things, the trap meet, the boating meet, the swimming meet, and then Fun Week, you know, the big games.
Songfest when it was
Oh,
before,
sorry.
before it got too soft and they didn't want to do it anymore. So you wouldn't cry in front of your parents if you lost.
Well, it's funny because the summer, the tradition is so ingrained that the summer, when Meltzer and I sort of ran the place, we didn't have the nerve to call it Beaver Eagle. We just called it Red and Gray. And this is the 1983 pentathlon, but between the red and the gray. We didn't want to go with the Beaver and Eagle.
Tell us about Fun Week.
Fun. Well, there was something every day.
Well, so the last week of camp, right? You got to start with you went to bed at night, and
Yeah.
nothing was decorated, and then what happened?
Well,
Rich,
all night.
somebody?
Richie, take over.
No, you do it. You do it. You do justice to Fun Week.
Well, the night before Fun Week, the counters went to that arts and crafts shop and made posters, right, of all the events of Fun Week. You know, Belgrade race, Capture the Flag, Commandos, this, that, and the other thing. And then when you woke up the morning of Fun Week, all the bunks near the mess hall were decorated with these posters. It was very, very colorful, very fun. And every night there was something, that council fire, and of course, my favorite event, the steak and corn roast. So to this day, if I ever have a 5-ounce ribeye, I always say, bring it on a piece of white bread. They say, what are you talking about? You want a toasted white bread? No, bring it on just a piece of white bread and a little corn this big. But make sure the corn is boiled in sugar and milk to make it perfect. Best corn you ever had, right?
So these
Oh,
Fun
my
Week
God.
these Fun Week events would be literally all camp. So you have 8-year-olds competing in Capture the Flag against 16-year-olds, which is ridiculously dangerous.
And in fact, and in the old days, there were strategies where the kids in bunks 1 through 4, the littlest kids, whether they were, 8 or 9 or 10, were used in a defensive way, so that the big, mooses, who were all of 15 years old, but the big guys had to be really judicious about the way they ran down, the length of the whole field to get into a stockade, because you really couldn't kill anybody.
You would
But-
get a running start from the dining room during
Right.
during Cowboys and Indians.
Right.
A running start down the dining room. You are like cooking right into that field. Like you could knock a little kid into a bunk.
Yeah,
And it was like rugby scrums, or, to get into those stockades.
into the stockade.
But that was
Yeah.
the great thing, like about commandos, which, your offense had to start on the lake in canoes and rowboats. And remember, if you were in a rowboat, that was like, oh no. But, you attacked from different flanks, you landed, and then you went for the different flags in different parts of the camp. The whole place had flags. It was kind of an amazing thing.
It was amazing.
Um,
I have been dying to get all the rules to these games because as you're coming
Right
in,
here, baby, right here, commandos.
Look
As
no
you-
farther.
as you're coming in a canoe, the defensive team is throwing blocks of wood at you
Right.
to try to get them in your boat.
Right, you could get sunk before you landed.
Before you landed. That's why I thought that was the best part of Fun Week, because it combined both. There were 3 flags, one at the pioneering area, there was a flag at the bell and a flag in the field. Field flag, bell flag, pioneering flag. And the
Right,
strategizing, oh my God.
right. So there were,
If you got captured, you had to go into the stockade. And there's nothing inappropriate about what I'm about to explain to our audience, but you would have to take, you would get a little piece of paper, and it was you, as if you were younger, you were worth less points, and the older you got, you were worth more points. And you'd have to fold this piece of paper and hide it somewhere within your clothing. You could slice a little, like if you had Adidas sneakers, you could slice one of the slit and put the piece of paper in there. If you got caught, you had to go into a tent, right? And you would be stripped to your underwear while the defensive guy had 60 seconds to try to look and find your paper. If they found your paper, right, you're out of the game. And then if they didn't, you put your clothes back on, and you had to go show the judge that you still had your paper hidden, and you could go back and drew it again.
to get your
Insane.
point value, it is, to think of it, to talk about it, it's freaking insane. It really, we all had the benefit of, picking it up and doing it. But it really, when you describe it, it's like, what are you people, nuts?
And who came up with this, BB? And
Right.
then the
Oh my
Belgrade race.
God.
I'm going to tell you so the Belgrade race was the worst day of the summer. I don't think
Why?
any kid liked that thing.
Why?
Each division had to go, and you would go to some random place around and get in a bus and go a half an hour here, a half an hour there, and the counselors would get out and hide things.
No, wait.
No, that's
That's
the
treasure hunt.
David.
Oh, that's the worst day. Treasure hunt. Hated that. Hated that. Wait a minute. And one of you guys, Richie, I think you helped me. You said to me, so before you went to to where you were going, they'd give you a riddle, and you'd have to figure out the riddle, and then they would tell you where you were going. So Richie, you said to me, if they ask you a big Awinda, it's a gust of wind. So a big Awinda, and so I swear whoever did the first clue while we're at camp says, the first clue is a big Awinda. I raise my hand and I go, Augusta. And they go, how do you know? Augusta wind. Got points for my team. Thank you. And then you went off to Augusta to go look, to do some ridiculous treasure hunt. And then it took,
And you looked looked for pieces of paper hidden on a building or something?
yes,
Yes,
Right.
each little group, you had a certain color little construction paper. And at each place that you went, and again, figuring out the clues, the riddles were to the places, like as you said, Augusta. Then the counselors who were on the trip with you had a few minutes. You stayed in the truck or the bus, and they had a few minutes to hide 2 or 3 of those little pieces of paper. The treasure hunt then was swarming over a building in a meadow, wherever the hell it was, to find these pieces of paper, because that was more points. And sometimes you didn't find them, sometimes you did. Then after that, they do your next clue, and then you went from Augusta to Smalls Falls, whatever it was, and it would all
Yeah.
start over again. And that was the one that was a full day.
Right.
Everything else was a
That was a full day.
half day for the Belgrade race or commandos or whatever.
And it took them days to figure out who won. And if you asked Billy Levy who won, you'd get points deducted.
Right, right. But
Right, Andy?
later,
Andy?
it was, again, as a counselor, it was really fun to try to make one of those things happen, you know, to sort of figure it out
Yeah.
and plan it, to not have to do it. But that was also, you know, those were the nights, besides the steak and corn roast, you had, you know, North Wind, which was the Belgrade equivalent of sort of Christmas. And it was, you know, I don't know, something a little sentimental, but the thing that, I don't know, David, if you were there when Vinny, maybe not, but this happened twice. It happened when Andy and I were kids, and it happened, right, Andy? You saw the first one, and it happened once again when we were counselors and did it over again. Vinny disappeared all day. Nobody knew where Vinny was. And everybody freaking loved Vinny. And so whether you were a little kid or, you know, a counselor, you actually, Vinny was older, you didn't know what was going on. And Vinny, you know, Vinny had a kind of a loose way of being in reality sometimes, you know. So everybody wondered. And when I was a kid, the terrible, abominable chefs, I remember, as
Sal
we
and
were
Joe.
going into dinner, came running out of the dining room while we were assembled, and or we had just gone in, they rang the bell, whatever, ran out, and the cookie like ran and grabbed Jerry, the head counselor at the time, and he was hysterical. And out of the kitchen, 4 guys are lifting Vinny, who's covered in flour and stiff as a board.
Oh, God.
Vinny had been locked in the walk-in and died. And as a kid, we were hysterical. And they put him down, and he sort of, like the Tin Man in The Wizard of Oz, sort of, you know, gets to moving again. And he said, "North winds tonight." You know. Anyway, we did that once again, because God bless Vinny, he was there maybe, I don't know for how long, but you know, Vinny was there forever.
Who else were the camp characters that you guys remember? So Vinny DeAngelis, who when I was there basically just did the laundry and messed up the laundry.
And it's
You
not
wanna
like
see-
he didn't wash
wanna
it on
see-
a rock, you know, he just
You
ended
want to
out.
see a treasure?
Yeah.
You want to see a treasure?
Oh, no,
Please.
this Army t-shirt? Oh. I tell you
This
what,
is
Andy,
This is Vinny's T-shirt that stands for Army Athletic Association, because, you know, he was a big West Point guy.
right.
And on the back, it says, "No excuse, sir."
Well,
Wow.
Vinny,
You know,
Vinny gave me this a million years ago.
he gave me one of the ones that just said Army on the front.
Yeah,
I wore that until it was shredded. I couldn't wear it anymore.
yeah.
Yeah,
Until it
Vinny was great.
Until it was threadbare.
Andy,
fact,
tell us, Andy,
of-
go ahead, Rich.
Of
Sorry.
all those administrators, you know, Vinny, of course, he was the only one who came through, if you will, into Greg's era from Mort's era, you know. But he was also the best. He was like a coach and a buddy and a tormentor with the most loving way, you know, not like Jerry, who really had some anger behind it. Vinny was great.
Andy, tell everybody about John Roach, because I only got to spend 2 summers with John, and
Well,
if it weren't for John, I probably would never have, gotten into theater like I did and have a career in, I wasn't an actor, but there was something special about that guy.
Well, I'm gonna start in a very small way, but Richie is, so,
I know.
let me do this. I'll just show you John doing his thing at the Belgrade Little Theater.
Oh,
Yep.
wow.
Okay, so, I'll do mine quickly. The Belgrade Little Theater is what John started. This is from the late Dr. Ron Hurston. These are live recordings from Belgrade in the 50s. So this is how I can listen to my father. Dr. Hurston wrote a beautiful introduction about John Roach that I can get to everybody and will eventually, I'll figure out. But a lot of people have this from the reunion. This is just extraordinary to read this. It's the most fascinating man that many of us have ever met. As Richie said at the 1980 reunion, he brought Broadway to Maine for all of us. And I will fail if I continue to talk about John Roach without Richie taking over talking about John Roach.
Well, it's pretty interesting that the three of us each had a really distinct relationship with him. And yeah, I think in many ways he saved my experience there as a kid, because I found something else that was fun to do, and I played the piano a little bit, and he's actually changed the style of my piano playing. You didn't know it, but he had a really freewheeling, a very old-fashioned way of playing, and it kind of that I kind of appropriated and fascinated him by, because I was pretty good then at playing by ear and transposing, from one key to the other. And he really showed, you had this sort of amazing nature. You had all these athletic pursuits. You had all the water sports that many of us never saw like that in our lives. And then all of a sudden you had this whole other creative force. And whether you wanted to do, stage crew, or you wanted to be on stage, behind stage, it was miraculous what he pulled off. I could never pull off when I took over for him for a few years, before I did other things at camp as a counselor. He did a different show every week. It's mind-boggling, and it's just amazing. Of course, the camp was bigger then, so you could have different groups doing different things, but they all looked different. They were, there were musicals, there were, comedies, there were, whatever, all sorts of things. Nobody did it like he did. And clearly, as whatever the three of us have in common, I think we all have differences, and we certainly had our differences, in the 60s and 70s. And yet we all found a place with John that we wanted to, come back to every year.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. What was the largest? Do you guys know what the largest at capacity? Were you guys ever there for capacity? What did that feel like? When I got there, it wasn't. Andy, see if you could pull your camera a little to the left, or slide to your right a little bit. Thanks. What was it like at its capacity, and how many kids were there, boys?
Andy probably has official documentation, which I certainly
Well, I
don't.
have I'm trying to count the 1958 tribal list.
I'm going to take a guess while you do that, but we have a short time together. So I think that capacity, or at least regular operations were somewhere between 150 and 175.
That's, oh my God, that's just what I was gonna say.
Right.
Yeah,
And,
Yeah.
you know, the last summer, his last summer, Mort's last summer, it was 33.
Mm.
And, you know, we had an amazing year because, you know, we saw the kids got off the bus and they all said, well, where's the next bus? You know, where's the other bus? And there was a great, you know, sort of quick depression that we very quickly filled.
Yeah.
And we were like all in it together. And so camper, counselor, whatever the age, the boundary kind of just, you know, morphed a bit. And we were all kind of moving forward to have a great summer. We certainly didn't have Beaver Eagle that year. What are you going to do? You know, the 2 teams of 16 was not going to make it.
What year was that?
76.
76. Look at the size of the trees by the lodge.
It's reflecting, so I sort of can't see, but
76.
76. So what we're going to do now is we're each going to tell 1 or 2 quick, funny stories that we remember that happened to us or, you know, while we were at camp as a camper or a counselor. I'll give you a quick one, a very quick one. And I'll go for just when I was 8 years old. We went to Small Point. That was the trip that we went on. Rich, you were on it because you were the tick that went that year. And Bob Smullen was the character nature counselor, and very large guy, loved food. And when we went to Small Point, he went and he got himself lobsters, and he put the lobsters in like a little bay area, so that when all the campers went to sleep in these nasty tents, the counselors would then have a lobster boil. And we all went to bed, and we heard screaming because when Bob went to get his lobsters, they had all washed out to sea. True story?
the tide rolled in and I heard it too. My lobsters.
Right.
But the only amendment to your memory, which is spot on, is that what it was that, you know, karma got him. Because one of the beautiful things about the place and about camping trips is if we were going to do something special, we would all have done it. And in fact, those lobsters weren't even for the counselors. They were just for him, much less for the kids. And that was the karma that kicked his ass, because that's not what you did. You know, on camping trips, you know, they were all about, you know, treats and new experiences and climbing things you never climbed and canoeing in water you didn't know, right? And
Yep.
anyway, but you're right. My lobster.
Andy, funny story.
There's too many. I remember I was in bunk 7, so that was my second year. I guess these counselors, they stood out way far from the cabin and started throwing rocks, pebbles onto the roof, hours after talking about this giant bird that used to come from out of Great Pond called the flying zilch. Zilch meaning nothing. So we started hearing little pebbles and then bigger pebbles, and the counselor said, "I think it's the flying zilch. I think it's the flying zilch." They threw big rocks on the roof. They had to take us to the infirmary. The whole bunch of kids started crying and screaming. So they had to go get the nurse and the doctor, and they gave us these little cups full of like grape juice or something. And we said, "What is this?" They said, "It's a tranquilizer. It'll calm you down." I said, "Oh, a tranquilizer." We said, you know, we're 9 years old, 9 or 10 years old, but scared to death of the flying zilch. Nobody knew what zilch meant. We didn't know it meant nothing. But these pebbles would hit the roof. Oh my God.
Richie Teller, you're on.
I have 2, but one I will do is I was in bunk 12, and we were 12 years old. So, you know, getting old enough to be really pains in the asses to our counselors. And we were just hawking them night after night. Bring us something back when you come in, bring us a pizza, bring us ice cream, whatever, bring us something back. And
From Whippers.
from Whippers, and could have been anything, but we were little bastards, as Vinny would say. And anyway, one night we were fast asleep and we got woken up, and Alan Levy was one of the counselors, and he brought a few other people in so that everybody could be with a kid when they woke us up. And they said, come on, get up, we brought you something, we brought you ice cream. And they shoved these ice cream cones in our faces. Cake cone, big thing, and it was freaking shaving cream. And we were like, all the next day, you couldn't get rid of the taste no matter how many times you brushed your teeth. So we just stopped asking forever.
That's good.
The other thing that this was something funny that was funny once at camp and then funny in college. Again, remember the photograph, that long photograph?
Yeah.
Jim Long,
Oh, yeah.
the Waterville photographer who had that big camera that had to start on one end and slowly, don't move anybody because the camera catches anything you do, blah, blah, blah. And every other year or so, somebody would start on one end, run around the back while it was moving, get back on the other end. It didn't always work, but I remember one year that it really did. I think it was Danny Borden, I'm not sure.
I think it was Pickles.
Oh, Pickles Hoffman.
Yeah.
Well,
Because I remember the
it
story,
worked twice.
and they didn't catch him, and it came out that way.
Came out that way, so it was memorialized forever.
Yeah.
When I was, my last year in college, I was helping my professor edit a book about It's a Wonderful Life. We had the Frank Capra papers at the archive there, and it was this wonderful research project, and we were publishing the script and memorabilia and photos from it. And when it was published, I forget what you call it in publishing, basically the inside and outside cover, and anyway, there was a photo that leafed from the inside of the front cover of the hardback to the facing page of the inside cover. So it was like one long photograph. And what it was photograph from the It's a Wonderful Life wrap picnic, in which Jimmy Stewart and Frank Capra did just that. They were on one end and the other end, and it was like, see, we didn't invent that.
There's actually one of those photos available on eBay right now from a year that right before I started, like in the late 60s. So if anybody wants to buy it, if you put in Camp Belgrade on eBay, you can buy a Jim Longley picture. What do you got, Andy?
I have a whole bunch right there over there. But from the reunion, the 2008 reunion.
Yeah.
One of the first interviews is a gentleman named Victor Block. And the CB picture, he did the same thing.
Huh.
And it came out, and they had to use it. And Mort Eiseman dragged him into his office and read him the riot act.
Famous Belgrade people. Who do we got? Anybody famous that went to Belgrade? I know a couple that you guys talk.
Go ahead, Andy.
No, go.
Well, the Roy Lichtenstein.
Right.
artist,
First Grand Sachem.
and I have actually, his widow is on the board of the organization that I'm working for right now. It's just a crazy coincidence.
So Roy Lichtenstein, yes, I knew that he went there. Very famous pop artist, right?
Sure.
Anybody
The fir-
else? Do we have any other
First
famous
Grand Sachem.
alumni? I thought we did, but if you guys can't think of it, besides the
Well-
three of us.
Well, from my actual year, Mark Lormer is a producer of the Napa Valley Sonoma Film Festival.
Well, somebody like that Steve Strogatz is a really well-known mathematician and professor right?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And the
He was
other,
there when I was
again,
there.
this is New York City centric in certain communities, but Morris Offit, whose placard I remember seeing when I was a kid, I finally met him about 10 years ago. He's a philanthropist and a very successful guy in finance.
Right.
But he is in Jewish philanthropy. He is a real sort of lion in New
Sure
York.
is. Andy, before we kind of wrap up, what do you got you took out a lot of stuff. So,
Oh, in fact, you know how I knew that was going to be a great reunion in 2008?
because I wrote, because I told you I was going to
You told me it was going to be an amazing weekend. I don't like the word hoarder. I prefer to be known as a organized preserver of treasured memories.
Right.
Bingo.
Well,
I'm not a hoarder.
I will take credit for starting the Camp Belgrade website, which started us all getting back together again in about 2006, which then took us to 2004.
Next
and I-
year,
and
it'll
I-
be 20 years old.
And I remember, Andy, when your dad was sort of ill, your mom told me at the reunion that website really brought him happy days. So it was worth getting putting it together. And now we have a Facebook group, and anybody who's watching these podcasts of My Camp Lives On, if you don't have a Facebook group or you don't have an alumni website, you got to do it, because look at the three of us having fun in the other episodes that we've
Yeah.
shot. The memories are only going to stay alive if we keep them alive. Andy, what do you want to show us before we go? Come on, you got a whole couch full.
Oh,
of
I
stuff.
got it. Well, the book called The Sachem, where they wrote about, each, the first year it was called The Bunk, 1937.
Hold it back a little bit. Do you have actually a sachem? Talk about what the sachem
Well,
was.
the sachem, I have, right over there, I have my father's sachems. I think I left mine at the reunion. I think somebody hauled off with my sachems, but I have my father. It would talk about what the kids did all summer, tell you where they were
Yearbook.
from.
It was a year.
like
It was a yearbook that came out 2 days before the end of the summer, and
Yeah.
it had the, which we're going to do in a minute. It had the oath. The three of us are going to do that before we sing the alma mater. But you would have everybody sign it, and I still have my 4 sachems and the note that you, Rich, wrote to me, and Andy and Andy's brother Tommy, and those are things you save forever. There was a page on every bunk, and then there was a page on there was a page on every bunk, and there was a page on every activity.
Yes,
Right?
yes.
So it would talk about what went on in the theater that summer, and it talked about those of us that went horseback riding, and I went horseback riding because you could bring a quarter and get a Coke. I didn't want to go
Right,
horseback
exactly.
riding.
Me too.
For instance, in 1941, there was a chemistry lab.
Right?
And it says Bobby Reebok, with several assistants, worked out the timing for the acid and hypocolor changes. Now, Bob Reebok is the oldest camper. He was started in 37. And I'm
It was
still in touch with
boxing.
him.
There was a boxing arena before I got there. When I got there, that was used for waiters, I think, to live in.
That's what Vinny did,
That
right?
was Vinny's sport.
Right? Well, guys, this has been a lot of fun. Andy, what did you want to show?
There's too much to show.
What's the brown plaque over there?
That's my Grand Sachem paddle.
Oh, nice.
Make these paddles, which
Got
I
it.
keep right next to my father's Sachem paddle.
Wow.
Wow, this is such cool stuff. Before we do these traditions of camp, Rich, any final thoughts you want to share?
Well, David, just want to thank you for organizing this and letting us, obviously we could talk for hours, and we could bring in a dozen other people and have a little big mosaic of a Zoom reunion like this, certainly. But thank you for the privilege.
Andy?
Final thoughts. Thank you very much for doing this. I don't think singing the alma mater is going to go over that big. I can't really carry a tune, but
Okay, it's part of the tradition. So first we'll do the,
Oh.
what does it say on the, and with your, we got to do it, what it says
The
on the
Belgrade
cover of
Oath.
of the sacrum, the oath, right?
Oh, it's right there.
Yeah, ready? Remember,
Right.
picture from the hand
To the hand,
To the
to
hand,
the heart,
to the
to the
heart,
heart,
to the man,
to the men,
and to
and to
Belgrade.
and to Belgrade.
how do you like that?
So now to end this, we are going to sing the Camp Belgrade alma mater. Ready? 1, 2, 3. In
the midst of Maine's
Of
great
great
mountain,
mountains,
by a
Eyes
camp
of
of
Camp of Fame,
under Belgrade's lofty
lofty
banner,
glory
glory to
to
its
its
name.
name. Let
let
the
Spirit
Spirit
carry onward every heart and soul
as we fight
fight for
Belgrade's
Belgrade's honor.
till
till
we
we
reach our goal.
I want to thank Richie Teller and Andy Miller for joining us
That may
here.
require some editing.
Maybe some editing. And I want to thank you all for watching. You can join us and watch our other podcasts wherever you enjoy watching your podcasts on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts. Thank you for joining us. Till the next time.
Take a moment to shine on happy